Welcome to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. My name is Dave. Are you ready? Are you ready? Let's go. We're going to start the episode right now. Happy to have you here. Let's do this. All right. So we're back. We're going to do a 3-part mini-series all around hiring a podcast editor. And I am a podcast editor. So who better to talk about this than somebody who actually does this, now taking clients and enjoying every moment of working with people just like you, looking to start their show, create their show, looking for advice on how to start, where to start, what to get, the gear, how does this all work? I have no idea, but I'm looking for someone to walk me through it. I got my hand up. I would love to help you and be a part of your journey about starting a podcast as well. You're thinking, Dave, I'm learning all these great skills editing my own show. Is there a business idea here? Is there something I can do? Yeah, there is. I did it. You can do it. And this is what this show is about. Podcast editing and support show. We're here to talk all things podcast editing and to talk to editors and people looking for editors. That's why the show exists. So that's why I'm here. And I'm really looking forward to this. We're doing a 3-part mini-series around the idea of covering off what to look for, what makes a great podcast editor, maybe what to avoid, and also some specific questions to ask any potential podcast editor that you might be talking to, whether you're using those sites where you can pay somebody a nominal fee and you get nominal service, or you're working with somebody one-on-one like me and you get to have great interaction without paying some other host website that takes a chunk of everything you give to your editor and they have to pay that. No. How about just let's work together, you and I? That's what I like. So just some thoughts around this. Again, it's a 3-part mini series and it's a great way to kind of kick off the podcast and give you some ideas around if you're a podcast editor, you should have answers to these questions, and you should think through this when meeting with new clients in the future. Or B, you're looking for that editor and you don't even know where to start. What do I ask? How do I even approach finding an editor? Well, again, you can hire Dave, would be me, or you can hire someone else and use this framework as your guide to picking your next podcast editor. So it's all about you. You ready? Okay, here we go. So I give you a little framework to this 3-part series. This is part 1 of the 3, episode 2 of the podcast, but part 1 of our mini-series. And we're looking at hiring a podcast editor, unlocking success, a guide to qualities every podcast editor should have. Every podcast editor should have these qualities when you're reaching out. This is part 1. Next episode is part 2. Around hiring a podcast editor, we're looking at communication mastery, a key trait of exceptional podcast editors, how they communicate. So that's part 2 of our 3-part series. Part 3, wrapping up the 3-part series, is again around hiring a podcast editor, red flags and green lights, what to avoid in a podcast editor. Well, hopefully I don't fall on that list, but we're going to talk through that as well. So 3 parts, again, kicking off the podcast editing and support show. I'm so happy you're here and you're getting value from this right from the beginning. Would love to hear more from you. TrueMediaSolutions.ca is my website. Head over there, leave me a message, email, voice message, whatever works for you. And I'd love to connect with you and answer any questions you have about being a podcast editor or hiring one. Like me. Let's move on. Here we go. Part 1 of our 3-part series starts right now. So you're looking to hire your next podcast editor. Maybe you've worked with editors in the past. Maybe you've tried to do this all your own and it's just not working out. Maybe you don't have enough room in your calendar. Maybe the tech skills are not as sharp as you thought they were, or you're on the brink of giving up if you have to do this all on your own. So hiring somebody would be your next best option. You have a little bit of money set aside. you have a way of paying for this, which is always good, and you're looking out to find your editor, but where do you even start? So, to introduce this first episode in the series, just a brief overview of the importance of a skilled podcast editor. Again, when you're learning a new task, a new skill that you've never done before, everything takes longer than you expected. I've heard of people editing a 1-hour podcast over the course of 3, 4, or 5 days because they got really deep in the weeds. They're learning how to use the tool. Everything's cumbersome. Everything's difficult. Everything's a learning curve. They're doing everything the longest way possible because they're not used to the tools. They're not used to the shortcuts. They're not used to thinking like an editor. They're thinking like a podcaster. And in learning and trying to do everything for the first time under extreme pressure to do it right, under extreme pressure to get this podcast out, and out of exhaustion after working 40 hours a week, playing with the kids, putting out the garbage, walking the dog. Oh, and then I have to edit my podcast. Ugh, it's a lot. So when we're looking at a podcast editor, finding somebody with the skills, the ability, the know-how to take this off your plate and give you the freedom to do what you want to do. It's amazing. Like right now at Walmart. Okay, I know, Walmart. You can shop online. Someone will pick out all of your groceries for you. It's all paid for in advance through your credit card online. You get your groceries. They send you a notification. They tell you what time to be at the store. You don't even have to come in. They bring your stuff right out to your car, put it in the trunk, shut the trunk, you drive away. You don't have to fight with kids wanting toys that they see. You don't have to stand in that checkout line and be tempted by all the chocolate bars or candy bars wherever you live. You can just stay in your car. You can keep the kids buckled in. You don't even have to shut the car off. You can just keep it running in the winter when it's freezing. You can just pick up your stuff and go. See, that's hiring somebody to do something that you would normally do on your own, giving you the freedom and the convenience of doing something else. And hiring a podcast editor is the same thing, where the task that you find mundane, cumbersome, overwhelming could be done by someone else, freeing you up to do something else. Think of it this way. You are a professional. Your time is worth money. And your billable rates could be up to, $50, $100 an hour. And you're out there cutting your massive lawn at your house, taking you hours and hours away from income generating opportunities to sit on a garden tractor or lawnmower and cut the grass. When at a fraction of the price, you could hire someone else to do it for you, freeing you up to now take more calls, spend more time with people, make more money, or rest and let someone else do it. So there's a trade-off, right? When you are doing your own podcast, you're going to pay in either time or money. That's the two you have to choose from. And you need to decide for yourself, what do I have more of? Do I have more time or do I have more money? And working with a skilled podcast editor allows you to focus on other things that push you forward in your business, push your podcast forward, helps you to become a better person because you're not dealing with some of that other stuff. So some qualifications and experience that we should look at when we're talking about hiring the perfect podcast editor. Some of the essential skills and qualifications to look for in a podcast editor would be what their finished product sounds like, how organized they are, how accessible are they, and then just their background. How long have they been doing this? How many shows? Do they have any feedback? Can they give me some real reviews of their work from some of their past clients or current clients? That's always great. Some specific questions to ask of your new podcast editor. How many years of experience do you have in podcast editing? Can you provide examples of your podcasts that you have previously edited? Questions like that really do help, because then you have a framework, you have a guide, you have something in mind that you can use as reference. And we all love to read those reviews on Yelp for restaurants, for the favorite pizza place. We love when people give us a review or a recommendation on someone they've worked with. And it helps us when we buy a book on Amazon to go through those reviews, good or bad, and go, is this going to fit for me? Is this the book I need? And having those reviews really does help. So ask for reviews. Ask for that. If you're a podcast editor, post your reviews. Let people see what people are saying about your stuff without having to ask. Put it on your website. The third part in all of this is the technical proficiency. Explore with your podcast editor the technical aspects of podcast editing, and some questions to ask them. Like, what software or tools are you proficient in? Where's your skill set? What's your go-to? How do you handle audio quality and eliminate background noise? Little questions like that help your podcast editor to realize that they're talking to somebody who knows their stuff. You're a podcast host. You know what sounds good to you. And you can communicate that to your editor. That'll help so much because you're both talking the same language. The next part in all this is to understand your podcast style. You need to find a podcast editor that understands and aligns with your podcast style. Are you all like, hey, everybody, yahoo? Or are you more detailed and thoughtful in your podcast? That's two different editing styles. That's two different ways of approaching. The music could be like, boom, in your face when you hit play on your episode, or subtle and immersive and complimentary. There's so many things that your podcast embraces beyond the words coming out of your mouth through a microphone into somebody's earbuds. There's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that you need to know what you like, and you need a good idea so that you can communicate that to your potential podcast editor. Some specific questions you can ask around aligning with your podcast style and all that is to ask, can you share your approach to editing different podcast genres? Oh, like an interview podcast, like a solo hosted podcast, like an immersive podcast, maybe a magazine style podcast that are built into segments. Maybe it's story building where you're building a whole world with music and sound effects and immersive elements that add to the story to put you in the mood or actually in the story, and you feel like you're surrounded by the characters and by the environment. Those are all different types of editing. And one editor might be able to do one better than the other. You might find an editor that does them all. I love playing with podcasts and playing with music and sounds, and I've tried different podcasts. That's why I have 8 different shows, because I'm playing and figuring out what works for me in an editing sense to benefit the listener when they hit play. Another question you can ask them is, how do you adapt your editing style to match the tone of a podcast? Because what you don't want is that one-size-fits-all Cinderella shoe where you're trying to cram in different size feet into one shoe. You don't want to try to have a podcast editor who only does one style and tries to get everyone to blend into their one style. You need a chameleon who changes colors, blends with the podcaster. That's what you really need as a podcast host, is finding that editor that blends with you, that just gets you, that gets your content, that understands that when you do a pause like this, you don't really want that cut out. So it sounds like when you put a pause like this, it really doesn't, you really don't want that to stay in. You want those little gaps. You want the gallop in your voice. You want these cool elements that you don't want your editor to just assume to remove. There are tools that people download and then call themselves an editor and then find out later that their client downloaded the exact same tool and now no longer needs them as an editor because the editor was just using the tool. Those tools are not as intuitive as a person with experience, knowledge, and abilities who understands you. The tool can learn you, but it will never understand you, like a real human podcast editor. And lastly, just think about some of the budget considerations. When we're looking at hiring an editor, there is the budget conversation. And I know for a lot of us, we're doing this on our own. We work outside of our podcast. And this is really for the majority of podcasters. Like we talked in episode 1, podcasting is a hobby. And it feels like when we go to conferences, when we listen to big shows, they tailor their messaging around the big podcasts, where you have a team of 25 who do everything behind the scenes, and they have a budget, and they have a dollar amount, and they need to meet a certain target for every episode to be successful and renewed, whereas hobbyists, we don't have that. We don't have anybody looking over our shoulder telling us that we're allowed to do the next episode. So I know that as a hobbyist, having a budget for hiring somebody might seem out of reach. But then again, I go back to my example of Walmart or having somebody cut your grass. There are things that you do that take away from your ability to make money or grow or whatever. And if you can come up with a way of supporting a podcast editor financially, you will get better results, a better relationship, a long-term relationship, and you and your podcast editor can grow together. And I wouldn't be afraid of reaching out to somebody and saying, I'm on a limited budget. I would really like to work with you. What can we do? So one of the things I do for my team and for my clients in the early days is I just use my Buy Me a Coffee donation page. And I would do work for people, build them a website, edit a podcast, fix a big glaring error that they didn't know how to fix. I would do these kind of one-off things. Many of the times it was for free. And I would get reviews or feedback that I could use to put on my website. That's a great way to start. But using something that's a little less ominous as a Buy Me a Coffee page allows for the people that I work with to make a donation as they want to and build that relationship over time. So maybe that's the starting point. Start small, buy me a coffee, and then maybe grow from there. The big thing in all of this is just to remember that you get what you pay for. And if you have zero budget, maybe best for you to learn how to edit your own show and learn a new skill. I would love to help you with that as well, just so you know. I would love to coach you, get you going. And to that point, I would mention it before on other times, that when you're starting out, if you think that video is the best place to start and you have zero tech skills, no cameras, no lights, none of that, maybe an audio podcast would be a better start to get you going and get you learning how to podcast so that you can graduate to video in the future. It might be easier for you. So don't be put under this pressure that everybody has a video podcast, because they really don't. They really, really don't. So don't fall into that trap. When you're meeting with a podcast editor, you can ask about their pricing structure. For me, as a podcast editor, I have kind of like an a la carte setup, kind of like choose your own adventure type thing where you can pick what works for you. I don't do like a flat rate where it's all in for, a certain dollar amount per hour, because that might price me out of the ballpark for many, many hobbyist podcasters like me. So I kind of go with again, choose your own adventure, and you need this, I need a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I don't need the rest of this. So what's your price for that? that's kind of how I approach it, because I want to tailor something that works for you. And if you really need help with a podcast editor and you just don't have the time, it is going to cost you some money. So just keep that in mind. So be willing and open to ask pricing structures. What I like to do when I have that conversation with clients is I flip it right back to them. And I want to know, what's your budget? What do you think this is going to cost? Because your perception might be completely different than mine. So that's a great conversation starter right there. And then also ask if I have additional things that I want to ask or add to my list of things that you do for me as an editor. What does that cost? If I have special requests or changes that I want to see on an edit, is there a charge? Ask for all those things up front, and I would get it in writing. Even if it's just an email, at least you have a point of reference to refer back to when you have a question. Keep in mind, every time you add something new to your podcast editor's list, that's additional time away from other projects where they could be charging more and they've done something to help you. Just understand, every time you add, then just consider your editor at every stage. And what I would also suggest is to start off with a 1 month, 2 month, 3 month contract where you set and agree on a price together for X, Y, and Z, and then come back after that period of time, revisit your agreement, tweak it. If you want to add more things to what they're doing for you as an editor, talk about money again, sign up for another 2-3 months, however you want to do that, and just keep coming back to the conversation. You as a podcast host deserve to get the quality and the results you are paying for, and your editor deserves to be paid for what they're doing on your behalf. If you're part of a charity, maybe your editor would like to do some of the elements they do for free or for a tax receipt for services rendered. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. But again, going back to how I get paid, I'm using Buy Me a Coffee right now, and it's working because it works in different countries. It's pretty easy for the payee to make a payment. And yes, but Buy Me a Coffee takes a small amount out of that payment, and I don't see it, but the convenience is there. So choose a podcast editor that you can communicate with. They know the style of your show. They know how you operate. You're looking to build a relationship with this editor. If you have questions around hiring an editor, if you have questions about becoming an editor, and you're looking for feedback, head over to the information in the show notes, leave me an email, a voice message, and I'd love to talk to you and answer your questions and help you discover your path as a podcast host, as a podcast editor, or someone who's just pod curious. I would love to chat with you. Thank you for checking out the podcast editing and support show, and looking forward to part 2 of hiring a podcast editor coming up next, where we're going to be talking about communication mastery, the key trait of an exceptional podcast editor. Part 2 is coming up. Take care. Get out there and edit that podcast. Hey, thanks for being here for the podcast editing and support show. Again, if you're looking for support for your podcast editing, head over to truemediasolutions.ca. Would love to talk to you there. Great episodes coming up here on the podcast editing and support show. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.